They called him weak. Not because he chose to be, but because the world decided he was. Everywhere he went, eyes judged him before he even spoke. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, like gravity itself was testing his worth. He wasn't born special. No power, no talent, no destiny written in glowing letters. Just a fragile body and a silent heart that refused to give up. In a world that celebrates strength, weakness is treated like a sin. People don't ask how you became weak. They don't care about the nights you cried alone. They don't see the battles you fight inside your mind. They only see the result. And when the result looks small, they look away. He learned early that being weak meant being invisible, ignored in crowds, overlooked in opportunities, mocked when he tried, laughed at when he failed. Even his silence was louder than his voice. Every failure carved another scar into his confidence, and every scar whispered the same cruel message. You are not enough, but weakness has a strange power. It teaches you humility before it teaches you pain. It forces you to observe while others rush forward blindly. While the strong rely on talent, the weak learn patience. While others boast, the weak endure. And endurance, when sharpened by suffering, becomes something dangerous. Every morning, he woke up tired. Not from physical exhaustion, but from carrying the weight of disappointment. He looked into the mirror and saw someone he didn't respect yet. Someone who dreamed big but lived small. Someone trapped between who he was and who he wanted to become. And that gap felt impossible to cross. Fear followed him everywhere. Fear of failure, fear of being exposed, fear of trying again and falling even harder. Fear whispered excuses that sounded logical. Maybe this is your limit. Maybe you weren't meant for more. Maybe strength belongs to others. And for a long time, he believed those lies. But here's the truth they never tell you. Every strong person you admire was once weak in ways you'll never see. Strength is not given, it is forged. And forging requires fire. One day, something inside him snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet realization that hurt more than all the insults combined. If he stayed the same, nothing would change. If he kept waiting for motivation, it would never come. If he kept blaming the world, he would remain its victim. That day, he didn't become strong. He simply chose not to run anymore. He started small, painfully small. A single step forward when his body wanted to stop. One more attempt when his mind screamed quit. Progress was invisible, but discipline wasn't. No applause followed him. No one noticed. But something shifted inside his chest. Every drop of sweat became a silent rebellion. Every failure became a lesson instead of a verdict. He stopped asking, "Why am I weak?" and started asking, "How do I grow?" Weakness didn't disappear overnight. It fought back. Some days he relapsed into doubt. Some nights he questioned everything. But this time, he didn't surrender. He understood that pain was no longer an enemy. Pain was a teacher. Each scar became proof of survival. Each struggle added another layer of resolve. Slowly, almost cruelly, the world that once crushed him began to shape him. His posture changed before his power did. His mindset sharpened before his muscles grew. Confidence didn't come from winning. It came from refusing to quit. He learned that strength is built in silence, in empty rooms, in lonely mornings, in moments where quitting would be easier than continuing. The strongest battles are never filmed. They happen when no one is watching. People still doubted him. Some laughed harder. Others warned him to stay realistic. But their voices grew weaker as his focus grew stronger. He stopped explaining himself. Weak people explain. Strong people execute. Every setback became fuel. Every insult became motivation. Every memory of being underestimated burned inside him like a controlled fire. He didn't want revenge. He wanted evolution. There came a moment when he realized something terrifying. He was no longer afraid of pain. He was afraid of going back to the person he used to be. The version that accepted limits without testing them. The version that lived in excuses instead of effort. Strength began to show itself in subtle ways. Longer endurance, sharper instincts, calmer reactions. He didn't feel powerful yet, but he felt unbreakable. That was new. He understood now that weakness was never the enemy. Comfort was. Excuses were. Waiting for the perfect moment was. Weakness was simply the starting line. The world hadn't changed. The rules were still unfair. The competition was still brutal, but he had changed. And that changed everything. Every day, he stepped closer to the edge of his limits and pushed just a little further. Not to prove others wrong, but to prove himself right, to prove that growth was possible, that transformation was real, that strength was earned, not inherited. This was only the beginning. The journey from weak to strong isn't a straight line. It's a battlefield. And he had finally decided to fight. Growth is painful. Not the kind of pain that ends quickly, but the kind that lingers in your bones. The kind that tests your patience, your faith, and your sanity. Once he chose to move forward, the world did not open its arms to welcome him. Instead, it pushed back harder. The moment you decide to change, resistance appears. Your body resists discomfort. Your mind resists discipline. The world resists your ambition. And the past version of yourself fights desperately to stay alive. Every day became a war of consistency. Waking up early when sleep begged him to stay. Training when his muscles burned and trembled. Continuing when progress refused to show itself. There were no dramatic transformations. Only exhaustion and repetition. Doubt became louder as effort increased. Is this even working? How long will this take? What if I'm wasting my time? These questions haunted him during the quiet hours. Motivation faded quickly, but discipline demanded loyalty. Some days he felt strong. Most days he felt nothing. And some days he felt weaker than when he started. That was the cruelest part. Improvement rarely feels like improvement while it's happening. He watched others succeed faster. People with better genetics, better resources, better support systems. Comparison became another enemy. Every victory of others felt like proof of his own slowness. But deep down, something had changed. He no longer wanted shortcuts. He no longer prayed for miracles. He accepted that his path would be longer, darker, and lonely. And strangely, that acceptance gave him peace. Pain stopped feeling personal. Failure stopped feeling final. Weakness stopped feeling shameful. It became information. Feedback, a signal telling him where to improve. He learned to respect the process. To fall without quitting, to lose without surrendering, to bleed without begging for sympathy. No one was coming to save him, and that truth made him dangerous. There were nights when he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, questioning everything. Moments when quitting felt logical, moments when staying weak felt safer than risking more disappointment. But he remembered something important. Safety never built strength. Comfort never created legends. Then came the breaking point. Not a single moment, but a slow collapse. Fatigue piled on fatigue. Discipline turned into obligation. The fire that once burned bright began to flicker. He trained harder but felt emptier. He pushed further but felt lost for the first time. He wondered if this path was destroying him instead of building him. And that scared him more than weakness ever did. One day, his body gave out before his mind did. He fell, gasping for breath, surrounded by silence. No music, no cheering, just the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. And in that moment of collapse, clarity arrived. He realized he had been fighting himself instead of understanding himself, punishing weakness instead of refining it, chasing strength without defining what it meant. Strength wasn't about suffering endlessly. It was about control. Control over emotions, control over impulses, control over fear. True power came from balance, not destruction. That realization reshaped his approach. He stopped rushing growth, stopped measuring himself against others, stopped trying to prove his worth every single day. Instead, he focused on mastery. He learned to listen to his body, to sharpen his mind, to train smarter, not just harder. Patience replaced frustration. Consistency replaced obsession. Slowly, strength returned. Not explosive, but stable. Not flashy, but reliable. His movements became efficient. His thoughts became clear. His confidence became quiet. People began to notice subtle changes. Not his power, but his presence. He stood differently, spoke less, observed more. There was weight behind his silence now. The same people who once ignored him started watching from a distance. Some felt inspired, others felt uncomfortable. Because growth challenges excuses, and his existence was becoming a reminder of what discipline could do. But he didn't feel victorious. He felt focused. Focused on becoming someone unrecognizable from his past self. Someone who could endure storms without breaking. Someone who could stand alone without fear. He understood now that strength was not a destination. It was a responsibility. The stronger he became, the higher the expectations, the heavier the burdens, the fewer the second chances. And still, he continued. Fear tried new tactics. Instead of stopping him, it warned him. What if you lose everything? What if you become alone? What if strength costs too much, but fear no longer controlled him? It only informed him. He accepted that this path would separate him from many. Friends who preferred comfort, voices that mocked discipline, people who only supported dreams, not effort. Loneliness became part of the price. But solitude sharpened him. In silence, he confronted his flaws. In isolation, he refined his goals. Without distractions, he saw clearly. He began to enjoy the grind, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. Every ounce of progress was earned. Nothing was borrowed. Nothing was fake. The weak version of him still existed somewhere inside, afraid, doubting, hesitant. But now that voice was quiet. Not silenced, but disciplined. He no longer needed motivation to continue. Momentum carried him forward. Habits replaced hope. Identity replaced desire. He was no longer someone trying to become strong. He was someone who trained like strength was inevitable. And yet, he knew the hardest part was coming. Because real strength attracts real challenges. The higher you rise, the harder you fall. And the final test is never physical. It is purpose. Strength reveals its true meaning only when tested. Not in controlled environments, not in training halls, but in moments where everything is at risk. When failure costs more than pride. When quitting feels reasonable and continuing feels impossible. By now, he was no longer the person the world once ignored. But he wasn't a legend either. He stood between two versions of himself. The weak past he refused to return to, and the strong future he hadn't fully earned yet. This was the most dangerous place to be, because many stop here, satisfied with progress, comforted by improvement, afraid to push further and lose what they gained. But he knew better. Partial strength creates full vulnerability. The challenges grew heavier, not louder, but sharper. Failures now had consequences. Mistakes demanded accountability. There were no retries without cost, no excuses without exposure. Pressure surrounded him. Expectations replaced doubt. Eyes followed his movement, and for the first time, fear returned with a new face. Fear of falling from height. Before, he feared being weak. Now, he feared losing strength. That fear almost controlled him. He hesitated, second-guessed decisions, played safe instead of playing true. And slowly the edge dulled. One night alone again, he faced his reflection. Not the fragile one from the past, but the current version. Capable, respected, yet restrained. He realized something brutal. Strength without purpose becomes a cage. Power without direction creates hesitation. He hadn't defined why he needed to be strong, only that he never wanted to be weak again. That reason was no longer enough. So he asked himself the hardest question. What am I willing to protect? What am I willing to sacrifice? What am I willing to stand alone for? The answer didn't come instantly. It formed through memories, moments of humiliation, nights of isolation, days of relentless effort with no witnesses. And suddenly, clarity hit. He wasn't building strength to dominate others. He was building it to dominate himself. To ensure no circumstance, no person, no fear could ever control his actions again. That was his purpose. From that moment, hesitation disappeared. Decisions became decisive. Movements became intentional. He stopped reacting and started commanding. Strength aligned with identity. The final test arrived without warning. Not announced, not prepared for, just sudden and unavoidable. A situation where his limits would be exposed publicly, where failure would erase everything he built. The old him would have panicked. The previous him would have doubted. But this version stood still. Calm, not because he was confident of victory, but because he accepted the outcome. Win or lose, he would not betray himself. The pressure was suffocating. Every instinct screamed retreat. Every logical thought calculated risk. But something deeper moved him forward. Commitment. He stepped in fully. No half effort. No safety net. No excuses waiting in reserve. Every action carried weight. Every decision reflected years of preparation. Pain returned. Not unfamiliar but respected. Fatigue followed. Not feared but managed. Fear whispered again. But now fear listened more than it spoke. He pushed beyond what once defined his limits. Not recklessly, deliberately. Each movement precise, each breath controlled, each moment owned. Time slowed. Noise faded. Only intention remained. And when it ended, the result didn't matter as much as the realization. He didn't break. He didn't retreat. He didn't become the weak version again. He stood. That was the victory. The world saw strength, but it didn't see the cost. The years of doubt, the isolation, the discipline without reward, the suffering without sympathy they never do. After that moment, recognition followed. Respect arrived. Opportunities appeared. But something inside him had already settled. He no longer needed validation. Applause felt distant. Approval felt optional. His worth was no longer negotiable. Strength had become his nature, not his goal. He learned that the strongest people are not loud. They don't threaten. They don't rush to prove anything. They move with certainty. They speak with intention. They act without hesitation. The weak past still existed, not as shame, but as foundation. It reminded him of distance traveled, of lessons earned the hard way, of promises kept. He didn't hate that version anymore. He respected it. Because without weakness, strength would have no meaning. Now, when challenges appeared, he welcomed them, not out of arrogance, but readiness. Obstacles were no longer threats. They were confirmations. Confirmation that he was alive, that he was growing, that he was still moving forward. The journey from weak to strong had changed him permanently. Not into a monster, not into a hero, but into someone unshakable. Someone who could stand alone without fear. Someone who could lose without breaking. Someone who could win without losing himself. This was not the end. Strength is no finish line, only higher standards. But one truth was undeniable now. He would never be weak again, not because he was invincible, but because he had mastered the art of rising. And that is the kind of strength no one can take away. After mastering the art of rising, he understood something even deeper. Strength did not erase struggle. It simply changed how struggle was faced. Challenges did not disappear. They evolved. And now, they demanded more than effort. They demanded wisdom. He noticed how easily strength could become arrogance. How quickly confidence could turn into carelessness. How silently discipline could decay when comfort returned. So he stayed alert, always questioning himself, always refining his actions. Power tested character more than weakness ever did. When he was weak, he had nothing to lose. Now, he had everything to protect. His standards, his mindset, his identity. He learned to say no.
No to distractions disguised as opportunities. No to people who respected results but mocked the process. No to shortcuts that threatened integrity. Boundaries became another form of strength. The world still tried to pull him back. Not with insults now, but with praise. Not with doubt, but with comfort. And comfort was more dangerous than fear. He stayed rooted in routine. Early mornings, hard training, silent reflection. Growth was no longer dramatic. It was deliberate. There were days when he felt ordinary again. Not weak, just human. Those days reminded him that strength was not permanent without maintenance. So he kept showing up, even when motivation was absent. Especially then. He began mentoring himself through experience. Every failure was documented mentally. Every success was questioned. What worked? What didn't? Why? Self-awareness sharpened his edge. People asked him how he changed. He never gave a clear answer, because the truth was inconvenient. It wasn't one moment, it wasn't one decision. It was thousands of small choices made when no one cared. He understood now that strength isolated you differently, not through rejection, but through responsibility. Fewer people could relate, fewer conversations felt real. But loneliness no longer scared him. He trusted himself. Storms came again. They always do. Loss, pressure, unexpected setbacks. But he met them standing, not begging. Focused, not frantic. Resilience had become instinct. He stopped asking life for fairness. He asked himself for readiness. That shift changed everything. Even when knocked down, recovery was faster. Not because pain hurt less, but because despair had no place to stay. He had trained it out of himself. He remembered the boy who once feared effort, the one who avoided pain, the one who waited for confidence instead of earning it. That boy was gone. In his place stood someone forged, not perfect, but prepared. Strength no longer needed proof. It showed in patience, in restraint, in choosing the harder right over the easier wrong, in walking away from battles that didn't matter. He realized true power was selective. It did not react to everything. It responded only to what aligned with purpose. And purpose kept evolving. He wasn't chasing greatness anymore.
He was maintaining it, day by day, choice by choice. The journey from weak to strong had never really ended. It had transformed into a responsibility to never fall asleep again, to stay awake, to stay sharp, to stay hungry. Because weakness does not announce its return. It creeps in quietly, through laziness, through ego, through neglect. He vowed to never let that happen. No matter how far he went, no matter how high he climbed, he would always remember the pain that built him. Not to suffer again, but to stay grounded. Strength was no longer something he chased. It was something he protected. And that was the final evolution.